Welcome to Federation Square, where we commence our online discovery tour, exploring city places that tell the story of Melbourne's buildings, history, culture, and people. Today we'll be walking across the same Hoddle Street grid laid out by Robert Hoddle only 2 years after European settlement, as well as its extraordinary system of 200 lanes and arcades created by the Gold Rush. Federation Square celebrates the 100th anniversary of 6 British colonies uniting in 1901 to create the new nation of Australia. It is a cultural gathering place that includes the Acme Film Museum, the National Art Gallery, and the Koori Heritage Trust. Federation Square also celebrates the Kulin Nation, comprising 5 tribes, including the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of Neerim, or Melbourne. The plaza is laid with 470,000 tiles from the Kimberley Desert. These depict an 1864 Aboriginal bark painting of the cosmos reflected in water. Opposite Federation Square is Flinders Street Station, the great transport hub and meeting place of Melbourne. In 1854, the first steam train in Australia headed from this corner to Port Melbourne. Every 25th of April, thousands of people gather outside the station for the annual Anzac Day March to the Shrine of Remembrance, lest we forget. On the northeast corner is that great Gothic Revival landmark, St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral, where Melbourne's first public Christian service was held in 1835. On the 7th of December 1854, thousands of people gathered outside St. Paul's to protest the death of gold miners at the Eureka Rebellion. Melburnian support of the miners created democracy in Victoria and inspired the Southern Cross on the Australian flag. On the northwest corner is the famous Young and Jackson Hotel, formerly the site of the house of John Batman, who claimed to have signed the Melbourne Treaty with Aboriginal elders. Within 6 years, there were 5,000 settlers and 1.4 million sheep grazing on the traditional owner's land without permission or payment. Waterfront warehouses around Flinders Lane once held gold rush goods transported by ships and horses. Flinders, or the Rag Lane, later contained hundreds of clothing factories. Since 2008, factory lanes like Hosier Lane have become world-famous street art galleries. The Nicholas Building, with its exquisite headlight arcade, was created by brothers Alfred and George Nicholas, with income from their synthesis of aspirin in 1915. Today, aspirin is one of the world's most used medicines. Their building is a centre for many creative businesses, including arts, crafts, and clothes. In early Melbourne, ships arrived at Enterprise Wharf on the Yarra River. Passengers and goods entered the town through Customs House, today the Immigration Museum. The official day of Melbourne's foundation is the 30th of August 1835, when John Fawkner's Enterprise unloaded 9 passengers, including Melbourne's first European woman, 18-year-old Mary Gilbert. Collins Street was the Golden Mile when marvellous Melbourne was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Perhaps its most spectacular building is the 1891 Banking Chamber at 333 Collins Street. It was built just in time for disaster, the great crash of the gold rush economy that ruined many citizens' livelihoods. The Block Arcade was the centre of marvellous Melbourne, that fabulous, wealthy metropolis of the Victorian era, built on gold and thousands of hopeful immigrants seeking their fortunes. Here, the citizens promenaded in their finery, around Collins, Swanston, Elizabeth and Little Collins streets, courting, gossiping, or taking refreshments at the Hopetown Tea House, which is still serving high tea 5 generations later. However, in 1931, the Great Depression was raging with almost a third of Victorians out of work. Hunger was everywhere when an organisation called the Friendly Society said they were going to build one of the finest buildings in the country. A 12-storey building in just 12 weeks. You can believe in your country, your workers and yourself. They built the exquisite Art Deco building in 12 weeks. It remained the tallest building in Melbourne for 20 years. No wonder Melburnians love this building. The beloved Royal is the oldest arcade in Australia. An arcade, by the way, is a lane with a roof. There are almost 200 lanes and arcades in the 1837 Hoddle Street grid, a result of the massive gold rush migration to marvellous Melbourne. The famous robots Gog and Magog have been striking the hours since 1892. The Grand Melbourne GPO was the centre of Melbourne, and the distance from which everywhere in Victoria was measured. Its postal services connected Melburnians to their suburbs, nations and the world for almost 150 years. In 1898, Simcha Baevsky, an impoverished Jewish immigrant, arrived in Melbourne from Russia. He changed his name to Sidney Meyer and created Australia's greatest shopping empire. Melbourne families have been visiting the famous Christmas display windows since the 1956 Olympic Games. Melbourne's oldest theatre site is the fabulous Second French Empire building in Spring Street. The theatre is home to Federici, who died in 1888 and is Melbourne's most famous ghost. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. The 1854 Eureka Rebellion spurred a democratic parliament. This house of the Victorian government sits high on Eastern Hill on a ceremonial meeting ground of the 5 tribes of the Kulin Nation. From 1901 to 1927, this parliament housed the first national parliament of the new Australian nation. One of Australia's finest 19th century buildings in Australia was designed by a legendary teenage architect, John James Clark. The old Treasury building, now a free history museum, contains the bluestone vaults that were used for storing the gold that was escorted by troopers from the gold mining fields. The gold rush made Melbourne wealthy but respectable. This can be seen in the Collins Street churches, such as the Baptist Temple, Scots Church and Assembly Hall, and St. Michael's. For a while, the Assembly Hall was used as a women's mock parliament to practice suffragette ideals of parliamentary representation. Cromwell House is the huge private mansion of wealthy Melbourne hospital surgeon Diamond Jim Beanie, who had the unfortunate reputation of operating in a blood-soaked gown with jewelled hands and inviting an audience to watch. Beanie medical scholarships are still offered today at Melbourne University. The Athenaeum is the oldest public institution in Victoria, the venue for the first Melbourne Council and library, and since 1839 has hosted arts, science, opera, theatre and cinema. It premiered the first feature film in the world, The Ned Kelly Gang, in 1906, and the first talkie to screen in Australia, The Jazz Singer, in 1927. The Melbourne Town Hall is the home to city government, as well as tens of thousands of civic functions, including the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. In 1964, the Beatles appeared on the balcony before 20,000 screaming teenagers. In 1975, the young AC/DC band drove past singing, "It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll."
It's a long way to the top if you wanna
return to Federation Square, where our journey began. But the Melbourne story continues, as per the 1842 Melbourne City motto, Viris acquirit undo, which means she gathers strength as she goes.